the dark, wet alley was slightly illuminated by Sarah's cell phone light as she shined it every few seconds to see where she was headed. Her eyes scanned the darkness, and she shook crazily. What had happened to her last night was a mystery. She thought back to the bar. She'd just come in with her friends. Just a fun night out. Nothing could have happened, or so she thought. Now she was trembling, walking from building to building at 3 in the morning. Again she thought back, but everything was a blur. She passed an old ratty motel and a pub. Sarah made her way to the outskirts of her neighborhood, around a heavily wooded area. She walked. She clenched her eyes shut tight for moments at a time. She was huddled into her coat for warmth, as the cold rain covered her for what seemed like an eternity. Just as her eyelids took cover of her eyes, something shined out of the corner of her vision. She instantaneously flashed her eyes open once again, and her pupils became wide. She looked around. Nothing stood out in the blackness and the rain. She spun around and continued her way back, hoping that she would make it home. As she studied her surroundings, she remembered a shortcut that she took as a kid when playing hide and seek with her childhood playmates. It involved climbing through the woods. The cold woman hesitated, but came to the decision that anything that would get her to her warm home quicker is the better way. Sarah headed towards the forest, and as she made her way in, the first tree that she laid eyes on had been marked. What was marked on the tree mystified her. What looked like a circle, with an X inside. She knew nothing of its origin or meaning. She just assumed that it was some kind of gang symbol or something of the sort. Making her way into the forest, she recalled the fun times that she had as a kid. She thought to herself out loud, I miss those times, back when the world wasn't such a... Her voice trailed off. Sarah heard the loud crack of a tree branch off in the distance behind her. Terrified, she began running through the woods, and she soon became lost. She continued on anyway, hoping to find a way out. Her lack of caution quickly resulted in her leg being caught on a nearby lying root. As she fell to the ground, attempting to get up caused her even more pain. She cried out. The crunching of leaves became present again. She attempted to stand up and run once again, but her injury kept her in one place. She clenched her eyes shut out of fear. And as she opened them again, a tall, white man dressed in a suit stood before her. She had become visually impaired at the sight of this man. She began screaming in terror, but was soon silenced. Pale man that stood before her in the dark. 4 o'clock. What once was a young boy, now was a cold-blooded psychopath. Jeff the killer had finished what he called his daily rounds. The slaughtering of innocent people, this was almost all that flooded Jeff's mind. He dragged his feet up from the wet cement as he entered what he called his home for years. Jeff stepped foot into a world of tragic memories. Clutching 2 whiskey bottles in hand, Jeff had become a drunken killing machine. His brain was filled with the scent of murder. One thought that did cross his psychotic mind had been that since day 1, as the rain hit the weary house, Jeff began to recall the night in which he slaughtered his entire family. He chuckled at the thought. If it wasn't for his insanity, he might have thought about regret, remorse for taking the lives of the people that he once loved, but that wasn't possible at this point. Jeff was out for one thing, and one thing only. Death. 5 o'clock in the morning. He took another swig at his alcohol. What the fuck am I sitting here for? What the fuck am I sitting here for? As he got up to make his way into the night, he swerved a bit and took another chug at his whiskey. The alcohol hit his warm, bloody lips, and he felt an odd sensation. A sudden urge had hit him. He stood in the room, gazing out at the forest beyond the house. Jeff checked his pockets. Cigarettes, a lighter, and of course, his knife. Jeff knew that something wasn't right. The feeling that he got was a mix of the urge to kill again, and something far different than what he had ever felt before. He stormed out of his home, into the cold, wet night. Jeff was now in a dark street, his only light source being a lamp illuminating the road. The rain, still pouring, hit Jeff's back. He started to move in the direction of the forest. He struggled a bit. His alcohol consumption that night had been extremely high, and the killer approached the desolate forest. Before he entered, he took a quick glare to his left. Jeff was not far from a cemetery. He trembled towards it. A thought blew into his mind, almost like the wind on a breezy afternoon. The last piece of his family was only feet away, and it beckoned him. He moved his feet away from the forest and towards the graveyard. Slowly, Jeff walked, yet he tripped a few times, spanning the short distance. He approached a grave, and Jeff graced it with a rotten odor of death. His jacket being covered in the blood and remains of his victims, Jeff simply gazed at the cold slab of granite. His vision was too distorted to make out any sort of word. Because of this, he just stood and stared. Jeff's insides began to feel uneasy, and his throat became dry. The same feeling from moments before. Jeff stumbled back to the forest. While trembling toward the woodland, his eyes wandered to a tree a few feet farther out than the others. What looked like a small grayish piece of paper could be seen hanging by a nail. His eyes blurry, he was unable to read it. He took no attempt either, and crept into the darkness, slowly, almost as if he recognized this place, as if it were his true home. Squeezing his 2 whiskey bottles, he studied the forest in a drunken haze. Jeff admired the darkness. It reminded him of a black hallway, one where the murderer could easily slash the necks of his victims without being seen. As he continued walking, Jeff became, in a way, infatuated. The simple blackness swirled around him. Muttering to himself in unrecognizable gibberish, he continued to trot. Something felt a bit odd. The crunching of leaves seemed too loud to account for only one person. Jeff felt as if something was lurking beyond his line of sight. "Who's there?" Jeff growled. An abundance of noise could be heard, but nothing out of the ordinary. The chirps of crickets grew louder as Jeff studied his surroundings. "Come on, chicken. I don't really like games, and not hide and seek at all." As Jeff announced this, a quick rustling from a nearby bush could be heard. He slashed at it before the sound could come to a silence on its own. Jeff then saw what was hidden out of sight the entire time. "Damn rats. Just some good-for-nothing pests," Jeff proclaimed as a rodent scurried from the leaves. After he had seen what was hidden in the bush, he continued his midnight stroll. The rain crashed against his back and came to a slow stop. His vision was becoming very blurry, and a loud noise